All right, welcome to Chapter 4. We're going to talk about the skin and body membranes, and mainly like the integumentary system is how that is all referred to. So we'll get started on Chapter 4. The first thing we'll talk about are the membranes, and of course membranes, the function of these membranes are to cover all the body surfaces. And when we're talking about membranes, we're talking about even the skin. The skin is considered a membrane. So it covers all the body surfaces, lines all the body cavities, and it provides a protective barrier around our organs as well. And of course, body membranes are classified according to the type of tissue that they contain, or what they're made out of, is how we classify them. The first of these is going to be the epithelial membranes. And this, of course, is going to include the cutaneous membranes, the mucous membranes, and serous membranes. And then there's the connective tissue membranes, which is synovial membranes. These are kind of grouped together because we'll talk about them here just in the following slides all together. So the cutaneous membranes is the skin. It is a dry membrane. It's that outermost protective barrier that protects our bodies and keeps us safe. There's also the superficial epidermis, which is composed of some of that, or that superficial, that outside layer. It's that keratinized layer of squamous epithelium, so those little squishy kind of flat cells. They're densely packed together and they're keratinized, so they're hard, they're a lot more rigid. And what it does is it helps kind of create a barrier between the inside and the outside. It's a moisture barrier. And then, of course, further on down, we've got that underlying dermis that's mostly that dense, fibrous connective tissue stuff down there on a little bit deeper. So, cutaneous membrane, it's just the skin. So when somebody looks at you and says, hey, dude, your epidermis is showing, don't worry, it's not your zipper unzipped. So it's just your skin. Mucous membranes, they're a surface epithelium type. Will depend on its size. So depending on where that mucous membrane is located will determine what it's made up of. So the stratified squamous epithelium we usually find in the mouth and the esophagus. It's stratified squamous because it undergoes quite a bit of stresses in those particular areas. The simple columnar epithelium is in the rest of the digestive tract, and its main function there is for absorption. And not so much breaking it down and chewing it up and making it into smaller parts where the stratified is located. So then we have some underlying loose connective tissue underneath that membrane. And of course, these membranes will find that they line body cavities that open into the exterior parts of the body. They're moist membranes, and they're designed for absorption and secretion. So those are the mucous membranes. Digestive tract and mouth and that kind of place where you'll typically find them. Even find some even in the lining of the lungs, on the inside of the lungs, those mucous membranes. While the mucous membrane is a pretty durable membrane in general, it can still be very fragile. It's very susceptible to changes in its environment, especially abrupt changes, such as ingesting caustic substances or chemicals or those kinds of things. And realize that these membranes are designed in such a way so that the body has the ability to absorb what's being taken into it. So in our digestive tract and in our lungs, those membranes that are present there are designed to absorb things. So if the wrong thing gets in there, it's going to absorb it whether we like it or not. That's just the job of the mucous membranes. Serous membranes are different. Basically, they line organs and help protect organs inside of the body. Basically what they do is you'll have a membrane that's covering an organ, and then you'll have another membrane that actually covers the inside wall of the body. And between those two membranes, there'll be some fluid, just a very small amount of very slippery fluid called serous fluid. And that fluid allows those organs to move inside of the body without creating friction. For example, our lungs meet up with the inside of our chest cavity. But if we don't want our lungs to be rubbing flesh to flesh against the chest, inside chest wall, then we need to have something that's going to protect it. Well, this serous membrane, you have the visceral layer that covers the organ, the viscera or organ, and the parietal layer that lines the inside of the cavity. And then you have that fluid in the middle, so when we take a breath, our lungs can move inside of our chest and not rub up against the wall of our chest, creating friction. There is a condition that if you have an infection in that particular membrane that can cause rubbing together, and that's pleurisy. Pleurisy is actually an infection in the serous membrane, usually lining the lungs. We see that in smokers sometimes, and we get an infection inside of that membrane, and the lung actually rubs almost like sandpaper against the wall of the chest, and it's quite painful. So that's what pleurisy is. So when we look at how this membrane works, we can see the fist inside of this balloon, and we see the balloon that's actually the parts of the balloon creating a membrane around the organ, where the fist would be the organ, and then we have the membrane on the outside of that, or the balloon on the outside of that, that's creating a virtual space inside of there without allowing air in there. We've got fluid in that particular space. We see that in many areas within the body. The lungs was one of them, like I referred to, but also we see that around the heart, the pericardial sac, the sac that surrounds the heart. It has a visceral lining and a pleural lining, or a parietal lining, that separates the heart and allows it to be able to move in there inside of that sac without creating friction, which is very important. So, just like I referred to, there's a peritoneum that surrounds the abdominal cavity, and realize that there's an actual space in between those two membranes, or a potential space anyway, that if we start to leak blood or fluids or something like that into that space, it will begin to fill up that space, and it'll put pressure on the organs that it's up against. So if we had an abdominal bleed in the peritoneum, it could actually bleed and begin to occlude off the organs. Same thing with the lungs. We can get air or blood in that pleural cavity, in that pleural space, that potential space in there, and we can wind up with a hemothorax or a pneumothorax, which is blood or air in that inside of in between the lung and the wall of the chest, which can be very life-threatening if it's left untreated. And of course, pericardium, we can wind up with something called a pericardial tamponade. Is when blood leaks into that sac that's surrounding the heart. The blood has nowhere to go, so the pressure builds and builds until it starts to kind of strangulate the heart, and the heart can no longer function. Pericardial tamponade around the pericardium. So this picture here's a pretty good idea of where those linings, those mucosal linings around those organs are, and that potential space. Realize that space that it's showing in between there is a potential space. It has potential to grow and be much bigger than that, but it's not an actual space. There's a little bit of fluid in there that's taking that up. And then, of course, we've got some synovial membranes. We find these mainly around joints, and it helps lubricate the joints. It holds some specialized fluid in there in those joints, kind of separates the joints from the other tissues as well, from the bone and the muscle tissues. But really what it does is it secretes that lubricating fluid that helps things move. Probably the best example of a joint like this is our knee joint, where that comes together. But we also find that in our fingers. You know, we have those synovial joints in there. We can see that lining right there that's got that fluid in there. Now, if we tear that cartilage or, something like that, then we kind of disrupt that. And even with fluid in there, it can become painful, especially if it's a weight-bearing appendage like our knee. It would be very painful. You tear that layer of meniscus in there, or that layer of cartilage, and it becomes painful. All right, so talked about some glands. Now let's look at the integumentary system. Basically, the integumentary system is nothing more than the skin. It is the skin, the cutaneous membrane, and all of the skin derivatives, sweat glands, oil glands, hair, nails, are all part of the integumentary system. So we're going to talk about all of them, briefly here, and so you'll have kind of an idea of what they're all about. So the skin, the skin part of the integumentary system protects the deeper tissues. Of course, it's kind of obvious that it protects it from the outside environment, but realize that it protects it from bumps, from changes in chemicals, from chemical changes such as acids and bases, bacterial damage. You may not realize this and you may not want to know this, but you have bacteria living on your skin right now. It's just a fact of life. There's bacteria everywhere. It's all around us. Bacteria is not necessarily entirely a bad thing. Bacteria is very helpful, so long as it knows its place. You have lots and lots of bacteria in your digestive system that actually enable you to digest the foods that we eat, and it's just part of the natural process. We typically refer to that as normal flora, which we'll talk about when we get into the digestive chapter. But realize that bacteria is our friend. Bacteria is not always the enemy. You know, you go to the doctor and you take antibiotics. That's because this bacteria that's present is in the wrong place, and it needs to be removed from that particular place. Not necessarily that it's absolutely must be eradicated from the planet. That's not necessarily true. There are some bacteria that we could, I'm sure, do without, but generally, I don't want you to think of bacteria as an altogether bad thing, but it needs to know its place, and that's why we have to have the skin to separate the bacteria from the places that we don't want it. Okay? Skin also protects us a little bit from ultraviolet radiation. Of course, that depends on your skin pigmentation. If you're darker complected, you have a better protection from the sunlight. If you're pasty white, not much protection, and you probably already know that because the first time you went outside or you go to the lake or you go swimming or whatever, you come in bright red, you look like a lobster. Whereas your friends that maybe are a little darker complected, they're not burned at all. They maybe got a little suntan. The skin also helps protect from thermal damage from heat or cold, provides a little bit of insulation there, and it also keeps us from drying out. The keratin in our skin, in that outer layer, in the outer layers of our skin, helps protect us from water loss. So it helps control body heat, which is actually controlled by the nervous system. The nervous system controls that regulatory mechanism that either helps us hold on to heat or get rid of heat. We also, through our skin, get rid of some urea and uric acid. It synthesizes vitamin D, which is a very important function. And it detects touch, temperature, pressure, pain, vibration, those types of things. So the skin has a lot of functions that it does. But we can break down the skin, the layers of the skin, into two different parts. And then we can break these two different parts into more layers. So we break the skin down into the dermis and the epidermis. The epidermis is the outermost layer, and it is a stratified squamous epithelium. It's those little squishy cells all packed tightly together. It's been keratinized and cortified so that it makes it hard and it prevents water loss. So water can't get out, and water doesn't come in very well. It can be soaked from the outside to make it soft to where that we can begin to absorb things. So don't think it's absolutely impossible to absorb things through the skin, but it's much tougher for things to go out from the body outside of the skin just on its own. So we can put a nicotine patch or a pain patch or something on us and it'll be absorbed through the skin. Whereas it's less likely that we're going to lose water coming out of that, coming out through the skin. So the epidermis, that epidermal layer is actually avascular. There's no vessels going to it. It has no nutrition going to it. And in fact, most of the cells are keratinocytes and they're no longer functioning as cells. They're pretty much dead cells. Or they're in a stage of being dead and being solid and keratinized to where that they're more of a hard cell than a soft, squishy cell. And then the other layer that we have that we'll talk about after the epidermis is the dermis. And it's mainly connective tissue and some other things in there as well. So we look at these layers. We can see these layers on the chart here. Doesn't want to cooperate. So we see the epidermis It's just this small layer right up here. It's not a lot to it. It's a pretty small layer. And then the dermis is all of this down here below. So the epidermis isn't very much, but it's a very packed, very dense layer. And there's a whole lot going on down here in the dermis. So the epidermis, not a lot to it, a whole lot to the dermis, which we'll talk about both of them in detail. Okay? And then below that skin, or below the dermis, we have a place called the subcutaneous tissue. It's the hypodermis. It's the deep layer of the dermis. You may be familiar with the subcutaneous layer. If you have to have an injection, say, of insulin, or if they do, well, insulin is probably the best example of that. They usually give that injection subcutaneously, and they use a hypodermic needle to give that particular injection. They also have a little bitty injection if you've ever had to have a TB test. That's not really subcutaneous, that's intradermal. That's actually in the dermal layer. So it's just below the epidermis into the dermal layer is where that actually goes, not in the subcutaneous layer. People often mistake that TB skin test is done in the subcutaneous tissue. It's actually done in the dermal layer. So hypodermis means below the dermal layer, and subcutaneous injections we give in that hypodermic layer with a hypodermic needle. This structure is really not technically part of the skin, but it anchors the skin, so it's worth talking about. So it holds the skin and some of those organs in place. We find a lot of adipose tissue here, and it's one of those areas that serves as a really good shock absorber and helps to insulate deeper tissues, hold in the warmth, and insulate them. So now let's look at the layers of the epidermis. Let's look at them specifically. It's composed of up to 5 layers. Now, I know it sounds odd to say up to 5 layers because it is a little odd. Most of the epidermis, most of the skin on your body only has 4 layers. With the exception of the palms of your hand and the soles of your feet has 5 layers. So the majority of our skin on our bodies only has 4 layers. Palms of our hands, soles of our feet have 5. Did I say? Yeah, I may have gotten that wrong. 4 layers on everything, except for the soles of the hands, palms of the feet, palms of the hands, soles of the feet. Yeah, you get it, right? 5 layers on those. Of course, remember it's avascular. There's no blood flow to it. Most of the cells are keratinocytes. They're keratinized. They're fibrous protein. Makes them tough. They're no longer those little squishy cells by the time they get there. The layers are covered, from the next deepest to the most superficial, so layer upon layer. And those layers are in various stages of keratinization. So, if we start at the bottom layer, the deepest layer of epidermis, that's the stratum basale, or so you can think of it as the basal membrane, or the stratum germinativum. Wow. It's the germinating layer of the skin. It lies right on top of the dermis. It kind of has a wavy borderline with the dermis and anchors the two together. And the cells there are undergoing mitosis. So this is where the new skin cells are being created. All right? So right here in that basal layer, in the germinativum, in the germination layer, is where those cells are being created. Daughter cells are then pushed upward, and they eventually become more superficial layers. So as we wear cells off of the surface of our skin, new cells are created from the bottom. We've probably all had a blister, got a new pair of shoes and had to wear them, or worked outside, shoveling dirt or something, and wound up with a blister. What happened was we damaged the top layers of the skin, probably the top 3 or 4 layers of skin, 2 or 3 layers, to the point that it blistered underneath there and then peeled off, and that what was left is a really, really thin layer of skin. Well, basically what happened was we peeled off all of the dead layers of skin, and now we're down to that basal layer And that's why it's so sensitive and so tender, because we've exposed those nerve endings. We've gotten now we're a whole lot closer. Those nerve endings are closer to the surface. And it takes a while for that to build back up. The interesting thing that our body typically does is in response to that, it builds that layer up those layers up a little bit thicker, so that it creates a callus, and hopefully we don't have to worry about another blister there. The next layer is the stratum spinosum, and then the stratum granulosum, which we're not going to really talk about those two, and then the stratum lucidum is formed from dead cells from the deeper strata. And it occurs only in thick, the hairless skin of the palms of the hand, soles of the feet. This is that mysterious fifth layer that's present on your hands and feet, on the soles of your feet and the palms of your hands. So that's where that extra layer is. And then the stratum corneum is the outermost layer of the epidermis. Notice that it's a corneum. It's corneized, or keratinized. Trying to make up new words. And that is the outermost layer. Sometimes that's the easier way to remember those. Corneum being the outermost. And then, of course, the innermost, remember, is the basal, or the basal membrane. And, of course, that corneum layer the cells are kind of laid out like shingles on a roof, and they're filled with keratin. And that helps protect us. So, looking back on it, the 5 layers, the basal, spinosum, granulosum, and the corneum. On the soles of your feet and the palms of your hands, you have the lucidum, which is that thick layer. It's a very thick layer of skin. So, we can kind of see that there. Okay? Melanin is produced by melanocytes. It is a yellow or a brown to black color. They are mostly in that basal membrane of the skin, that base layer where all the new cells are created. It accumulates in those membrane-bound granules called melanosomes. The amount of melanin that your body produces has a lot to do with genetics and your exposure to the sun. You know, I've mentioned before about how the dangers of radiation, especially solar radiation from the sun, is at potentially causing skin cancer. One of the things that our body does to prevent or to protect itself, when you've been exposed to the sun and you get a little sunburn or just a light burn, or you kind of get outside and expose yourself to the sun, one of the things that your body does is it will produce more melanocytes or more melanin in your skin cells to begin to protect that layer that's below it that's generating those skin cells. That's why a suntan only lasts for so long if you don't continue trying to keep your suntan, is because once you stop the exposure to the sun, those layers of cells no longer producing melanocytes eventually work their way up to the surface, and now you no longer have a suntan. So that's your body's defense mechanism that, when you go lay in a tanning bed or something like that, or laying out in the sun, it's your body trying to protect itself from the sun is what's causing that suntan to happen. Now, some people are naturally more genetically darker than others, and that's because they produce a large amount of melanin. And there's also a skin condition that we see sometimes with dark-complected individuals, where they'll have white blotchy spots on there, where for some reason their skin has stopped producing melanin in certain areas, and it kind of gives them the blotchy-looked skin. I believe Michael Jackson had that. But we see that not only with African Americans, we also see that with many other dark-complected people. Sorry, one of the bells was ringing here at the school, kind of threw me off. There's also some dendritic cells. They're part of the immune system that let us know if there's a bacterial invasion or something going on. Those cells are down a little bit deeper in the epidermis. And there's some Merkel cells, which are some nerve endings that are touch receptors. They're called Merkel cells that are kind of spread out throughout there. The dermis, just down below the epidermis, is 2 layers. even though it's much, much thicker than the epidermis. It's only broken down into 2 layers. It's the first layer is the papillary layer. It's the upper dermal region. So if we're going top to bottom this time, there are some projections called dermal papillae. Some of them contain some capillary loops. Others have some pain receptors. And these are responsible for our fingerprints. They're very unique from individual to individual. They say that these are created from us bumping around in our mother's womb and tactilely touching things with hands and feet, and the uniqueness of those, the way that they grow and the way that those capillary loops grow and do that is what creates our fingerprints. Now, what's the purpose of fingerprints? Well, actually, fingerprints are used to grip things. They're not something that the government installed in us so that they could identify us. They're actually designed so that we have some ridges to grip things and hold on to things with our hands and our feet. So fingerprints do serve a very valuable purpose. The second layer of the dermis is the reticular layer. It's the deepest layer. It has the blood vessels, sweat glands, oil glands, pressure receptors. I believe hair follicles and all that stuff are in that particular layer. The overall structure of the dermis, there's some collagen and elastin fibers located throughout it. It gives us some toughness and elasticity. There's blood vessels in there that play a role in body temperature regulation. If the body gets too hot, the brain sends out a signal that says dilate the blood vessels, and it dilates the blood vessels closest to the skin, so that it brings more blood past the surface of the skin, kind of like the radiator in your car, where the radiator in your car tries to keep your engine from getting too hot. That's what the blood vessels do in the body. It gets more blood to the surface of the skin so it can cool off. Another thing that it does too, in correlation to that, is oftentimes it'll cause us to sweat, and that sweat on the surface of our body combined with a little bit of wind will cool us off. So it will cool the body, the temperature of the surface of the skin off, and hopefully to cool off the core temperature of the body. That's the purpose of it. And of course, there's nerves going both ways, sending and receiving messages from the central nervous system. Okay, and we see the papillary layer and the reticular layers there. I know if we showed you a picture of those, or if you showed me a picture of those, I wouldn't be able to tell you which one was which. If it wasn't labeled like that, I wouldn't have any idea. So, we talked about this briefly, but there's 3 pigments that contribute to skin color. One of them is melanin, which we talked about, which is that yellow, reddish brown, and even black pigments. There's carotene, which is an orange-yellow pigment that comes from some vegetables. And of course, there's hemoglobin, which is a red coloring from blood cells in the dermal capillaries. And the oxygen content of that hemoglobin will determine the extent of the red coloring. What's interesting is how we see, red blood cells, but when we see blood in a vein, it has to do with the way light reflects off of the red blood cells through our body or something. I've seen something about that. That's why veins appear that bluish color through our skin, because it has something to do with the way that the light's reflected through it. And, I don't know, it's all scientific-y thing, but I thought it was kind of interesting. So if a person has red skin, it's due to the dilation of the blood vessels right below the skin that's bringing much more blood to the surface and turning the skin red. Sometimes it's embarrassment, maybe inflammation. Hypertension can cause that. Fever, allergies, just being hot, heat, being too hot, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, just being out in the sun and working can sometimes cause that redness. Pallor or blanching, when you kind of turn pale, can be emotional response. Believe it or not, people do turn pale from fear. What happens with fear is our body has a response to that, and it shunts all the blood to the core so that the vital organs, in particular the brain and the heart, can get all the blood and oxygen that it needs to be able to respond to that emotional situation. So it's not unusual for someone to turn pale when they get scared. And it's their body's a normal defense mechanism. It also could be because of low blood. They may not have enough red blood cells. They could be anemic. Low blood pressure, or poor blood flow to a particular area. If we see somebody that has good skin color everywhere but in their right lower leg, then we should suspect that maybe there's something obstructing that blood vessel going to the right leg, or one of the blood vessels returning blood. So somewhere there's an obstruction along the way that may be causing that particular limb not to look the color that it should. Jaundice, typically associated with a liver disorder, but it's that yellow looking color. And it's primarily from, oh, my mind just went blank. But what's happening is the liver is not removing certain things from the blood that it needs to be removing out, and it causes jaundice. And I cannot think of the word that I'm looking for that is the root cause of that. But it's mainly excreted in urine. We get rid of it. But anyway, sorry. Well, I'll think of it later when we talk about it in a later chapter. We'll talk about jaundice again, but we usually associate that with a liver disorder. Bruises, black and blue marks from hematomas. Bruises are just the varying stages of healing after blood vessels have been broken underneath the skin. The fresher they are, the more bluish, reddish color that they are, and as they progress, they'll start to get black and then into kind of a brown color as they start to go away. All right. So, appendages of the skin. So, the different parts inside of the skin, the different things that are in there. There's some cutaneous glands. All of the glands are exocrine glands in the skin. So, they're all glands that are going to excrete something onto the surface. So, you got sebaceous glands and sweat glands. We also have some hair follicles, and nails. Those are the appendages that we're going to talk about. And we can see them in this picture. Okay? Sebaceous glands produce oil, or a sebum. It's a lubricant for the skin. It prevents our hair from getting too brittle, and it kills bacteria. What's interesting is one of the things that we do with our hair care products is to make sure that our hair isn't oily. We wash all the oil out of our hair. And actually, that is intended to protect our hair. So we wash out all of the natural oil that our body creates, and then we add man-made oils to protect our hair from drying out and that kind of stuff. Seems a little silly. Just seems to be that's the way that the world works. Apparently, man-made oil smells and looks a whole lot better than our own. So you just make of that what you will. Also, that sebum helps to control and kill bacteria on the surface of the skin, so that we're not just covered with all this yucky bacteria. Most of these have ducts that empty onto hair follicles. Other open directly onto the surface of the skin, so they're in two places. Many of these glands are activated at puberty. So they're not too bad until we hit puberty, and then they start to go nuts. And of course, then we've got sweat glands, or pseudo-odoriferous glands that produce sweat, and they're widely distributed in the skin. There's two types of those pseudooriferous glands. There's aericrine glands, which open via ducts and pores of the skin, and they produce sweat. And then the composition of that sweat is mostly water. There's some salts and vitamin C. There's some metabolic wastes, and maybe even some fatty acids and proteins if it's an apocrine gland. It helps dissipate excess heat, gets rid of some waste products, and the acidic nature of it helps keep bacteria from growing. So this sweat that we produce, like it says, it helps us cool off. It serves many purposes, so it's not altogether a bad thing. Unfortunately, the odor is from the associated bacteria. So some of the fatty acids and proteins in the metabolic wastes actually attract bacteria, or bacteria feeds off of it, and which is why we shower and wear deodorants and do all those kinds of things. Thank goodness. I can't imagine living in a time when we didn't. And let's see. The apocrine glands is the other type of glands. It empties onto the hair follicles. These begin to function at puberty, is where we see these start to happen more. It also releases sweat that contains fatty acids and proteins, kind of giving it that milky yellowish color. And these are the ones that the bacteria really feeds on. This is why, any of you that have children that have, grown children that have grown up, they kind of reach, especially little boys, they kind of reach that age of about 12, 13, 14, probably 12 or 13 years old, and you're going, we need to go to the store and get you some deodorant. That's because all of a sudden your wonderful smelling, well, mostly wonderful smelling little boy, now all of a sudden stinks like a young man. What's happening there is their body's changing and they're producing this type of sweat from their bodies, and mainly in their their armpits and in their groin, and that's what's causing this, is this bacteria that's feeding off of it. What we do with the deodorants is we actually, typically the deodorants do nothing more than to mask the odor. Sometimes the antiperspirants help prevent the sweating, but generally you can only going to be able to cover it so much before you just got to get in there and wash it all off. All right, so the next appendage is the hair. It's produced by a hair follicle. Shouldn't be too much of a surprise. The root is enclosed in that follicle, and the shaft projects from the surface of the scalp or the skin. It's made of hard keratinized epithelial cells, so cells that are hard, they're durable. These doggone things will be around for a long time. They don't degenerate or break down easily. They stick around for many, many, many years after we're gone. There's also melanocytes that provide pigmentation for hair color. I used to have a whole bunch of just black melanocytes in my hair, and they have all turned white. So something must have scared me and changed all my melanocytes so that they don't produce dark colors anymore. Almost completely white now. Hair grows in the matrix of the hair bulb in the stratum basal, so in the basal portion of the hair bulb, and then projects upward. And you can see the different layers of that particular, a hair follicle and a hair, and all the cells that become part of that, and those cells get hard and rigid as they grow up and out of the follicle. A hair fiber or hair strand has a central medulla, a cortex that surrounds the medulla, and a hard cuticle on the outside. The cuticle on the outside is the most heavily keratinized region of the hair. As that hair grows and gets longer and longer and further away from its place of origin, it becomes much more brittle. Much less living things in it, and much less likely to survive the longer that it gets without a considerable amount of care. And there's a cross section of a hair follicle, okay, or a hair strand. A hair follicle is a hair follicle is surrounded by dermal and epithelial or epidermal sheaths that surround that hair root and kind of protect and create a little pocket where it grows. Inside of there's also something called an erector pili. It's a smooth muscle, and it pulls hair straight upward when a person is cold or frightened. We've probably all had that happen to us, and we were all familiar with the term that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, or the hair on your arm stand up, or gave you chills or goosebumps. That is the erector pili muscle standing those hairs up. Why is it doing that? Well, it's a fight or flight thing. When we're cold, it stands them up because it wants to try to trap some of our own body heat underneath those hairs. And I know most of us aren't quite that hairy, but it wants to try to trap some of that heat up, in between a layer of hair and the outside of the body, so it creates a kind of a dead space of warmer air there to keep warm us up. The other thing that it does is when we're scared, it stands the hairs up, and the hairs are much more sensitive to touch. So if something lightly touches against us, or the breeze blows or something like that, we feel it. We're a lot more aware of it. It's a defense mechanism. It's a protection mechanism is what we do. Very similar to what a cat does. A cat's hair, all of its hair stands up when it gets all riled up. And it's a defense mechanism. Of course, a cat's trying to make themselves look bigger, meaner, when they do that. Of course, then we have sebaceous glands and pseudoaphorous glands as well that are located in that hair follicle as well. So, fingernails, toenails, they're kind of scale-like modifications of the epidermis. Very, very heavily keratinized, as you can imagine. They do have a basal layer that goes in beneath the nail bed. It's where all that growth comes from, so all the way in that basal layer. They lack pigmentation, so they're colorless. Unfortunately, there's no way to give them pigmentation. So you're still going to have to go in and get your nails done and colored and all that kind of stuff if you're into that sort of thing. Well, that's why our fingernails are all the same color, because they're not keratinized. This kind of is pretty self-explanatory, but with fingernails or toenails, there's a free edge. The entire body of it is visible, and we can see where it's attached. There are the folds of it are skin folds that overlap the edges of the nail. Typically, we call that the cuticle. You know, that edge of that nail where that folds over. And of course, growth occurs from the nail matrix down in the basal layer of that. The root of it's embedded deep in the skin. And that proximal nail fold there is the cuticle that we're probably all pretty familiar with. Okay? All right. All right, so we've learned something about skin. We've learned about some of the structures associated with the skin. I want to talk a little bit about some things that can cause some imbalances. We talked about homeostasis and maintaining balance, but we can have some things happen with the skin that can completely disrupt that balance. One of those things, probably the most dangerous thing that can happen to us, is burns that damage that skin cells or damage those tissues. It results in damage or complete death caused by heat, electricity, radiation, or even chemicals. The dangers associated with that, first and foremost, are dehydration, electrolyte imbalances, and of course, the body going into shock. What's interesting is people will always say, well, it's bacteria is the problem. Actually, we're pretty good as a society of being able to stave off the bacteria associated with losing our skin. The problem is we can't fix the imbalances or the other issues, fluid-related issues from the loss and the shift of fluids that goes on when there's a large amount of burns to somebody's body. And that's typically what gets them. It's not very often anymore the infection, so much as it is the dehydration and the other associated things that goes on within our bodies because of that dehydration and that shock to our system. Realize that the largest organ in your body is your skin, and if you severely damage 70% of the largest organ in your body's going to respond. It's not going to be good. What if you damaged 70% of your heart? You're not going to survive. The skin's basically the same way. There's very few organs in our body that we can do without, 50, 60, 70% of. Very, very few. So when we damage them to that extent, oftentimes the result is not going to be good. So, the result, of course, is fluid loss and invasion of bacteria. Like I said, we're much better at controlling the bacteria issue. It's the other things that we can't fix. So when someone's burned, we need to be able to have a way, it's not like we can, it's very important for us to know the amount of skin surface that's burned on somebody when we're looking at treating them. So we need to have a system that makes it easy for us to be able to determine that. And all of us be on the same page so we're coming up with the same numbers, or at least as close to the same numbers as we can. One of those ways, and this is just one, there's one or two other ways out here. This is probably one of the quickest ways, is the rule of nines. Basically, we divide the body into 11 different areas that we can use for a quick estimation of the body surface area that's burned. Each area represents about 9% of the total body surface area, with the exception of the perineal area, which only represents about 1% of body surface area. Now, remember this. When we're talking about the rule of nines, we're talking about just getting an estimation of the body surface area that's burned. We're not talking about making a determination of whether or not that particular area that's burned has any significance. I realize, we all want to go, well, the genital area should be a larger percentage. Well, it's a small percentage of the body. However, it is a very important area of the body that if it does get burned or damaged in such a way that we're not able to do normal bodily functions, then it's going to create some serious problems. So just because it's 1% doesn't mean that you can't have a severe or serious life-threatening burn to that 1% area and wind up in a burn center. So if you look at it, this is how we break it up in the rules of nines. And if you look at the arms only say 4.5. Why 4.5? Well, because we're only looking at the front side of the arm. If we turned her around, the back side would be 4.5 as well. Face, 4.5. Back of the head, 4.5, which would make 9. The trunk is 18. Each front side of the leg is 9. Each back side of the leg is 9. So that's where we come up with the rule of nines. If we total it all up, it comes up to 100. I know I've added it up before, but it does come up to 100. What's important to know about burns, or what to note about burns, is the severity of the burn. Probably every single one of us has had a first-degree burn. It's only that epidermal layer is damaged, skin's red and swollen, hurts like the dickens, and we're very uncomfortable for 2 or 3 days until that pain and sensation kind of settles down because we've got our skin all wound up. Second-degree burns is what we call a partial thickness burn. It involves the epidermis and the upper dermis are damaged. So we've damaged the epidermis into the dermal layer. And we see some red blisters and those kinds of things start to form with second-degree skin or second-degree burns. Second-degree burns are extremely painful. First-degree burns hurt. Second-degree burns are give me some morphine painful. And that's typically how we treat them. We treat them with pain medication and pretty strong doses of pain medication. The thing that we have to worry about, though, with treating with pain medication is what's the point that we give them too much pain medication and they stop breathing, or we control the pain? We have to realize that we're never going to be able to completely control the pain in a severely burned person. We're only going to be able to numb it to where that they can stand it. And different people are going to have different responses to that. But we have to be cautious that we don't over-medicate somebody or under-medicate somebody. So it's important to walk that fine line. So that's second-degree burns. Third-degree burns are full-thickness burns. It destroys all the skin off of that. The burned area is relatively or nearly completely painless. Third-degree burns are painless because it is actually burned through to the nerve and burned the nerve itself. So the nerve is no longer sending the pain signal out. Usually requires skin grafts to repair it. And the skin is kind of a gray, white, or black in color. It's pretty obvious the first time that you see it. And it's very obvious the first time that you smell it. On the top, we see that poor girl that's laid out a little too long. And she's turned herself into a lobster. It's going to be very painful. On the second picture there, we see the blistering of the hand and all that. That's a very good second-degree burn. This burn is actually a significant burn being second degree, even though you're thinking, well, it's a very small surface area. However, we have to use our hands to eat. And it interferes with our ability to eat and survive. So that creates a problem. And this bottom one down here looks like a child, probably a leg, third-degree burn. The concern about this type of burn, too, is not only that it's third degree, but if that goes all the way around that extremity, that creates a real leathery, thick, hardened area on that skin that can begin to occlude or begin to cut off the circulation to the lower part of that leg. So it's called a circumferential burn, and those are of particular concern. Okay? First, second-degree burns. A burn is always considered critical if it's over 25% of the body and it's second degree. You can have 100% of the body in a first-degree burn and they're not really going to consider it critical. But 25% second degree, 10% and third degree. But if there are any third degree burns to the hands, face, or feet, it's critical burn. Sometimes even second degree burns. And I usually go a little bit farther because if you have an infant or an elderly person that has second degree burns to their face, their hands, or their feet, they are, they're in a bad way. They're not going to be able to take care of themselves. And then we have to worry about swelling and those types of things. And so those are typically considered a more severe burn as well, and they should wind up in a burn center. But they may not be considered critical, but they still may wind up in a burn center. So it may sound a little odd, but all right. So some other skin infections or imbalances. We can have infections such as athlete's foot. It's caused by a fungal infection. The interesting thing about fungal infections are a lot like viral infections, whereas they use our own skins or our own cells in our body to survive. So the only way to really kill them off is to kill the cells that they're surviving on, which is really not a good idea. So athlete's foot can be tough to cure. It takes quite a bit of time to cure that. It's much better now than what it used to be. Used to have outbreaks of athlete's foot in locker rooms, in the gym and that kind of stuff, and a whole basketball team or wrestling team with athlete's foot. Boils and carbuncles. I've never seen a carbuncle before, but it sounds interesting, and I like the word carbuncle. Just want to keep saying carbuncle. So carbuncles are caused by bacteria infections, and those are easily treated. Cold sores, on the other hand, are caused by viruses. Most of the time, it's a herpes virus. I don't remember which version of the herpes virus that it is. What's interesting about cold sores, we have some people that seem to have them all the time and some people that have never had them. I am in the latter category. I have never had a cold sore. I'm very, very fortunate in that area, probably less fortunate in another area. If you have cold sores, you're probably making ugly faces at your computer right now and wishing ill of me. But realize this, you probably are immune to something that I'm not. So it's usually a trade-off. For instance, I don't get poison ivy. I can walk through poison ivy, doesn't bother me. I won't itch a bit. But I'm allergic to cats and dogs and just about everything else. Ragweed and it's a fun time in the spring. So also we can have some infections and some allergies. One of the things is contact dermatitis, causes an allergic reaction. Impetigo is caused by bacterial infections. Sometimes we get those little ones, will get those from a mosquito bite. They'll get a bacterial infection in a mosquito bite or something, and it'll turn into impetigo. Psoriasis, the cause is unknown, but it's usually a trauma infection or a stress, which will cause that. And we can see the cold sores. Oh man, that poor person with them cold sores, that looks painful. Impetigo looks like no fun. And of course that psoriasis, that flaky, scaly. Realize that the first two are probably contagious. The last one, psoriasis, is not. Even though psoriasis looks really, really bad, and you're like, I'm not touching that. It's probably the safest of the three to touch. All right, and we've talked about this one before, cancer, which creates abnormal mast cells or cell masses. It's classified in two ways, either benign or malignant. Benign means it doesn't spread. Malignant means it will metastasize and move to other parts of the body. Skin cancer is the most common type of cancer, and it's also the most avoidable type of cancer. Now remember back in chapter 3, and it's page 85 to be more specific, during the stages of mitosis, they occur so fast that errors sometimes can be made. And the cells that result, they lack the control of the processes and cellular division, and they just kind of go uncontrolled and they become cancerous, meaning these cells that are produced were produced rapidly, and they're not functioning, they're not well-behaving cells. And this can be caused by something as exposure to the sun. During that critical phase of mitosis, when the cell is splitting or when the DNA is replicating, exposure to the solar radiation can actually damage the DNA and cause cells to go crazy and create cancers or create tumors, either benign or otherwise. A basal cell carcinoma is the least malignant. It's also the most common type. It arises from the basal cell, so it's in that basal layer of the skin where those cells are created. And the reason why it's the most common is because it's caused by suntan. And there's an example of it. Why is it right there on their face? Oftentimes we see these on people's face is because that's the part of the face that's usually exposed. This was especially true of farmers and ranchers and those kind of people that, they would wear a hat and they'd wear long sleeves, but there's still part of their face that was exposed that increased their risk. Squamous cell carcinoma metastasizes into the lymph nodes if not removed. So the squamous cell carcinoma is very bad. Good chance of survival, good chance of being cured if you get to it early. And it's also to be sun-induced. Stratum spinosum. And can you imagine? I don't know how you could go for very long to the point where that thing has grown so big. But wow, that just making me a little nauseated. I'm going to change the slide. And then, of course, we can have malignant melanomas. It's the most deadly. It's cancer of the melanocytes, so that those protective those protective cells that produce melanin, the darker complexion in the skin, they go haywire. These metastasize rapidly into the lymph nodes and blood vessels. And then it says use the ABC rule to detect. Asymmetry, border integrity, color, diameter, to detect it. And we can see that right there. It's pretty obvious. I mean, that's nasty. That's not good. That's scary right there. Okay? So, almost done. Developmental aspects of the skin. In youth, skin is thick, resilient, and well hydrated. So when we're young, we've got it going on. It's all good for us. But when we start to get older, we start to lose elasticity and it starts to thin out. It starts to sag and wrinkle and all those things. Gravity sucks, right? Gravity really does this to us, does us in. It's part of that process, but it's also a part of the normal aging process of how our body does things, Skin cancer starts to become a much more bigger threat the more we expose ourselves to excessive sunlight. And that is true as we get older as well. As we get older and our skin gets thinner, it becomes more susceptible to skin cancers. Balding, which I'm fortunate about. Graying, which I've started when I was about 17 years old, come with aging. Both are genetically determined. And of course, there are some other things, stress and drugs and all that kind of stuff that will contribute to that. But most of the time it's genetic. Anyway, so don't hesitate to email me with questions. Look at this. I kept us under an hour this time. No torturing you guys with 2 hours of lectures. Hopefully from here on out our lectures won't be as long. There's a couple of chapters that we'll probably go a little long on, but this will be a welcome break for you guys that busted your tails so hard in chapter 3. Chapter 3 was a tough chapter. Hopefully this chapter will let you get back on your feet. All right? We'll see you chapter 5.